Thank you, everyone. I'm glad you were able to come here tonight. My name is Deb Brinkman. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters. On our agenda tonight, we've got 2 announcements, and then Barb is going to introduce our speakers. At about 8:30, we will stop and take a break, and we'll have some time for questions. So, and then from 8:30 to about 9, then we'll wrap up after that. So that's kind of the format for tonight. So the first announcement that I have is our League of Women Voters of St. Louis Park, is 65 this year. And so we wanted to take a moment to ask you to help us celebrate. So I hope that you take a moment and get some cake and some coffee, some water, and help us celebrate 65 years of civic service here in St. Louis Park. A couple of the things that we've actively done, well, one of the very first things we did was we advocated for the Home Rule Charter. And so you may know that about 25% of our cities here in Minnesota are Home Rule charter cities. The other percentage of the cities are governed by statute. So we're very lucky that we have this home rule charter, and we have the flexibility to make the changes that we need to implement things as our city is changing and growing. So that was one of the very first things we did, was advocated for our home rule charter. A couple other things that we've done, we did a study on how police handled domestic abuse cases, and that actually resulted in policy change. So by being part of a system, by advocating, by studying the issues, we can really make a difference. We also started the tree replacement program. Remember when the Dutch elm disease suddenly came to town here? Yeah, well, one of our fellow League members said, hey, let's help start restoring the environment, and she kind of got us started on the tree replacement program. Another thing that we did is we did a handbook for new residents, and I think that's been translated now into, what, 7 different languages? Something like that? Yeah, just that's been a really big win. And then most recently, we did our kids voting program, which has been wildly successful and has been a real community effort. We appreciate everybody's participation there. And then most recently, we advocated for ranked choice voting, so that was pretty exciting. So we're looking forward to many more years of civic service. Thank you to everyone for helping us celebrate. So the second announcement that I have is we're partnering with our Human Rights Commission, thank you, our Human Rights Commission tonight. And so if anybody is here from the Human Rights Commission, stand up. Thanks for joining us. This, the topic that we have tonight is actually very important to, I'm just drawing a blank. Human Rights Commission, as well as the League of Women Voters. So, all right. Again, thank you for coming, and thank you to everybody for participating, and thank you for supporting our Human Rights Commissions. So tonight's topic is about the impact of having the citizenship question on the 2020 census. The census count drives our political representation and allocations for federal resources. There's concern that an accurate count may not be possible. So to introduce our speakers tonight is Barb Person. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our speakers tonight on the topic of the effect of the citizenship question on the 2020 census. Is that better? Yeah. Okay, I'll move it closer. Our first speaker tonight is Stephanie Boucher. She is a planner for the Minnesota Governor's Council on Development Disabilities from the Minnesota Department of Administration. And she is here this evening representing the State Demographer's Office, and it was pretty last minute as Andrew Verdon, who was originally going to speak, is sick, and so Stephanie, very last minute, volunteered to take his place. So we're very happy that you're here tonight, Stephanie. The goal of the council on developmental disabilities is to advocate for the education, employment, and integration of people with developmental disabilities into a welcoming and supportive society. Stephanie graduated from the University of St. Thomas School of Law in Minneapolis, where she served as a writing fellow, helping students learn the unique research and writing skills necessary to go out into the world and not get a job. She is married and has one 21-year-old son who apparently plans to live in her basement forever, she tells me. So we're very happy that you're here on such short notice, Stephanie. And I'm going to introduce next Nadia Roifa, who's sitting next to her. She is an immigration attorney at the Pratt International Law Office. An immigrant herself, Nadia was born in Russia, raised in Israel, and finished school in Canada. She earned a Bachelor of Arts degree from McGill University in Montreal, Canada, where she graduated with honors. She came to the U.S. in 2004 and attended law school at the William Mitchell College of Law in St. Paul. Nadia has actively practiced in the area of immigration law since 2007 and in the area of Social Security disabilities since 2009. As a consequence of her international life and education, she speaks Russian, French, Hebrew, Arabic, and with the help of her staff, some Spanish. She is an experienced and tenacious advocate for her clients. She assertively represents immigrant and disabled clients before the Executive Office for Immigration Review, U.S. Customs and Immigration Services, Board of Immigration Appeals, and the Office of Disability Adjudication and Review. When not working, she enjoys spending her time running outdoors and keeping up with her son, Isaac. So thank you for coming, Nadia.
Thank you all.
And last but not least is our third speaker, Shawn Walther. He is on staff here at St. Louis Park. He has 20 years of experience in planning and zoning, and his area of expertise is in redevelopment and plan implementation, where long-term community goals and policies intersect with current site and market conditions. He has enjoyed serving the city of St. Louis Park for the past 13 years, and he will be leading the city's complete count effort for the 2020 census. Shawn also worked for the cities of Anoka and Ramsey, the Minnesota Office of Environmental Assistance, and the Initiative Foundation in Little Falls. Shawn has a bachelor's degree in local and urban affairs from St. Cloud State University, and he studied urban and regional planning at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. He's also served as a past member, team leader, and chair of the Minnesota Design Team. We are so pleased to have Shawn here representing the city of St. Louis Park. So thank you so much, all three of you, for coming, and we look forward to your good questions after our presenters have made their presentations. Okay, take it away, Stephanie.
Hello. Thank you so much for coming. Normally, when I give census presentations,
We can't hear it. Use the mic, please.
Just press the button.
It's on.
The green light's on. Yeah, it's on. Okay, good.
it's on. I just need to be closer, is that it? Normally, when I give census presentations, I am there to reduce fear. This is entirely different. Barb has assured me that you all know more about getting people out to do their civic duty than I certainly ever will. So I applaud your efforts and your knowledge, and please accept my apologies if we're starting out at things that you already know. As I understand it, we're on camera. So for the very first time in my life, I get to say, wait for it, I'm not a demographer, but I play one on TV. Seriously, I'm like checking that off my bucket list right now. Andrew Verdon is the director of our census efforts for the state, and he works under Susan Brower, who is like insanely statistically gifted And boy, does that woman know her stuff. I am gifted to work 3 cubes down from her. So don't worry, I have this all under control. I'm going to start with a story. My son, Nico, is 21 years old, and yes, he's the one in my basement, apparently with no plans to leave. I told him that I was going to work on the US Census this year, this upcoming session, and he got this look on his face like I had utterly disappointed him. And I couldn't understand it, and I said, baby, what's that look that we got going on there? And he said, Mama, I thought you were one of the good guys. And I said, I am one of the good guys. It appalls me that someone would think I'm not, much less you. And he said, Mom, I work in the restaurant and bartending industry. My friends have immigration issues, and I'm not going to tell any of them that my mother is working on the US Census, and I would never ask them to fill it out. It would feel like I was betraying a friend. And I thought, wow, we have a great deal of work to do. People, a great deal of work. The perception is not reality. And we really need to get reality rolling here. We don't have much time. So let me begin with the basics. Again, apologies, you all know this, but for some people watching the demographer at home, we might begin earlier. My son asked me, I've never heard of a census. I don't know what it is. I don't know why it matters to me. If I get something in the mail, I'm going to ignore it because I don't want the government to know anything about me. And I thought, oh my God, were babies switched at the hospital that somehow my son thinks this? So I kind of started with him, and that was where this presentation came from. What is the census? It is required by the United States Constitution. It is mandated. It is the law. It can't be ignored. It's not a suggestion. It will happen every 10 years. And the law says every person living within the boundaries of the United States of America must be counted every 10 years. And the reason for that, as you all of course know, is fair distribution. Fair distribution of resources like federal money, of political power, and not just in the legislature, but the Electoral College, and data that is filtered down locally so that people who are in city governments know how many people are going to be on the roads in the next 10 years. How many seats do we need in the schools for the next 10 years? How many teachers are we going to need? How many are going to have to be hired at a higher pay rate because they need to be bilingual, at least bilingual? All those questions have to be answered, and they're answered by the census. It isn't something to fear. He was completely unimpressed. And so I continued. This is not unfamiliar to you all, congressional reapportionment after the 2010 census. Now here's the deal. Everybody in gray remained the same. Everybody in blue gained House seats. Everybody in orange lost House seats. Now, we have 2 outliers here, so let me explain this map. I assure you, Nico was thrilled at this point in my presentation. The orange is mostly north and east, typically within what we would consider the Rust Belt. Now we have an outlier there, which is Louisiana. Now, think, why would Louisiana have less people than it normally did when this census was taken? Hurricane. People fled for their lives. So when it was census time, this was not a priority. So they lost House seats. Now, if you go to the blue, primarily southern, primarily warmer, which is where the population tends to be moving these days or migrating, and we have the outlier of Washington. The outlier of Washington is gaining people because of the tech boom. They're gaining people like mad to work in an industry that is changing the world. The reason this really matters to us is because we maintained our 8th House member by, I want to say, I think 8,437 people last time in 2010. It was touch and go if we were going to maintain that seat or not. Why does it matter? It matters because as you logically divide up the state geographically, things are supposed to be equally distributed among the constituents. So, if you have fewer legislators because you have fewer people in the state counting as constituents, the geography of that district gets bigger, and the representatives have to work that much harder to reach you, and you have to work that much harder to reach them. So this map I dislike, and mentioned it to Andrew, 5 or 6 times, because it's counterintuitive. You look at the 7th district and you think, okay, well, they gained 37,479 people, right? Well, that's not really how it works. The 7th district shrunk in population, but had to grow in geographical size. Now, the Minneapolis and the metro areas, you see it says they lost 96,000 people. The graph isn't intuitive at all. They actually grew in population. So their geographical size diminished, and other constituents then had to be distributed out in order to keep everything even. You don't want some areas of the state more powerful than other areas of the state. Everything is about proportionality and trying their best to keep things fair. Now, this concept applies to state legislative districts as well. Districts with lower counts expand geographically, while districts with higher or gaining populations contract geographically, okay? That's not necessarily a hard concept, but it really, really matters in terms of how many people we have representing us in Congress. What I can tell you is this, and I'm completely going off script now, and Andrew can watch the video. The more rural counties in Minnesota are bleeding people. And those people are coming into the 7-county metro area. That really, really matters to the people in those outlying counties because they have fixed expenses, okay? If they have to reach 30,000 people in their census count in order to get this many dollars from the federal government to maintain highways, and they miss that mark, well, they don't get those federal funds. It doesn't mean that their roads don't need fixing. That's going to be a fixed cost. If they don't get to say a $30,000 or 30,000 constituent mark, their hospitals don't get smaller. There is a fixed amount of money that needs to come from the federal government that we really depend on in order to keep things running smoothly. So it really matters. After the 2010 census, I thought this was very interesting. Here's how the population migrated. The majority of the growth, as we mentioned earlier, occurred in the Twin Cities 7-county metro area. That area grew by almost 250,000 people in 7 years. And almost half of those people ended up in Hennepin and Ramsey. Having an accurate count, particularly in Hennepin and Ramsey, St. Louis Park, it's going to make the difference between success and failure here in city planning for the next 10 years. Now, who is moving in? While people from the outlying counties are moving into the metro, some people, like our snowbirds, are deciding to go south and stay there. And people who are moving in are often foreign-born. Let's see, I've got statistics on that somewhere, really. Oh, anyway. I will get to that more when I talk about the citizenship question, and I understand that that's what you're here for, answers about that. Let me please get through these 4 more slides or whatever, and we'll talk about the citizenship question. Part of the fairness that happens with an accurate count is, like we said earlier, the distribution of federal money. And I'm not talking little dollars here. I'm talking 15.5 billion, as in B as in boy, dollars come to Minnesota based on our census count. We typically do very well in the census. We typically are top 10 at least in terms of our response rates. So we do very well, and the reason we do very well is because we start here a year in advance. Lots of other states don't even have complete count committees, or Andrews, whose job it is to go out and spread the good word that the census is coming and everyone deserves to be counted. It's not a scary thing. You are here within our boundaries, and whatever the politics of it, we're following the law, we're following the Constitution by counting everyone. I questioned this number when Andrew gave it to me. He said that almost $2,800 in federal money comes per person counted in the census, which amounts to almost $28,000 per person over 10 years. So why does the census count? The money. One of the things that I've asked about repeatedly, because I have to admit completely upfront, straight up and all the way through, I have a bias in terms of counting people with developmental disabilities. That's where I come from, the world of the Minnesota Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities. And one of the problems that our people have is that they depend phenomenally on Medicaid. And yet people with developmental disabilities, who are amongst the most historically undercounted people in the state of Minnesota, need the Medicaid money the most, and yet they're amongst the least counted. That goes across the board. I'm a member of the subcommittee, the CCC Subcommittee for Cultural Engagement, which means how do you get people who don't respond positively when the government knocks on their door to believe it is safe to engage in their communities and not be punished for it? So we are working on that, and we have some ideas that I can certainly share with you at question and answer time. But it's the same concept. The people who need the bilingual teachers and who need the health care are the ones who aren't counted in the census, partly because they don't choose to be. Many don't choose to be, but because they're simply ignorant of why it is important and how it can benefit them. Fear is I think, the factor there, and ignorance. Not any malintent of any count. No one's trying to do anything wrong. But those are the people who need the services the most. And those services depend on them being counted in the census. So it really, really matters. These, oh, isn't this a marvelous slide? I also objected to this one. And yes, it's fabulous. You are not supposed to be able to see it. Please. What it is the 55 federal programs that are funded almost solely on the basis of the census count. That's a lot of programs, and they're really, really important ones. Please note, Andrew says, this does not include funding for state, county, or city programs, which are also based on the dicentennial count. So this isn't even counting Minnesota money. This is just the feds, and the money is huge. There are some problems that every census has, and there are some problems that are more unique to this upcoming census. Some common problems are distrust in government. You know, I open the mail, I go to my mailbox and I open the mail, and I say, look, honey, there's something from the government. And I fill it out and I go, oh, look, I don't even have to stamp it. You know, stamps are so expensive. And it's all over for me, and that's all the thought that I have given it. People who have not had those positive experiences or, say, work for the government may distrust it mightily, depending on being traumatized historically, or being terrified that the landlord will know that there are more people living in this house than the lease says should be. All right? Now, take it back. For me, I'm older than dirt, but back a long time ago, my worries if a census had come in the mail was, oh my gosh, I can't fill this out accurately because then my mother will know that I'm actually living with my boyfriend. And my landlord will know that I have a cat. And both those things are breaking my lease. And I'm gonna lie like nobody's business because I don't want to get in trouble. Just extrapolate that out to bigger and bigger fears, and you get more and more of an inaccurate count. Now, people who are foreign-born, who have been here for 2 or 3 generations, still are telling our subcommittee that they will not fill out the US Census because they don't want to jeopardize any relatives who are in the immigration process or who have some reason to fear that ICE could come knocking down the door. And it's tragic. This census is only good. There isn't anything bad about this census. All of the data that is gathered here is protected for, seriously, I'm not even making this up, 72 years. Not 73, not 71, 72 years. And probably you all know, but I had to learn this, that was based on life expectancy. Okay? Now, people are saying, what about the citizenship question? See, I said that right that time. Look, see how good I can do that? Citizenship question. One of the reasons that is so traumatically remembered by Americans is because the US Census data was used to pick up people to put them in internment camps. Now, in 1950, that question was not used. The question was, it went from, is this person a US citizen, to, is this person naturalized? Okay, better, phrased differently, maybe a little less scary, but still not okay. I have my little cheat sheets here all over. How do I want to say this? Our distrust in government has increased, I would say, over the last 4 or 5 years, and whatever political denomination we are, I think we can probably all agree that fear has increased for people who are foreign-born. One of the best things, and when I give you my little elevator speech at the end of this, one of the best lines to remember, if you remember something from what I say, other than my son is never going to move out of my basement, is that if you don't want someone to come knocking on your door, fill out the form when it comes to you. Enumerators, who are the knockers, will only come to you after 3 attempts have been made to get you to fill out your census form. They are authorized to make 6 attempts to get you accurately counted in that residence. If they can't reach you, They have the ability to stand back, look at who comes and goes in the neighborhood, knock on one of your neighbor's doors, and say, by any chance, do you know who lives here? How many cars do you see in the driveway, typically? And it's a guess. It's nothing but a guess. And it doesn't help anyone in that house or that apartment or that homeless shelter who would be the one benefiting from filling out the form accurately. It is against the law, solidly, completely, 100% against the law for anyone anyone who works with the data gathered from the US Census to release it to anyone. As a matter of fact, it is more secure in the US Census Bureau than in Fort Knox. Their badges won't open even their next door neighbors for anything. Everything is locked down tighter than Fort Knox. People are sworn for life to keep the secrets of the US Census, and if they don't, they can be imprisoned and fined $250,000. Your data is safe. Now, what about, well, maybe it's safe with the people, but what about the computers? And what about all the data that's floating out there that people, or normal people, aren't in charge of? If there is anything that the federal government will spend money on, it's to keep census data safe. This year, you can fill out, or this coming census, excuse me, this upcoming census, you can fill the census form out by telephone, but you can go online and do it. You can fill it out by checking the boxes and filling in the little tick marks on the mail. You can set your iPad up at your potluck or your garage sale and invite neighbors and say, I understand, I mean, this is fairy tale land, but here's the concept. You don't have to be a US Census worker to take people's data and enter it for them. That's amazing. That is game-changing. Oh gosh, have I talked for 30 minutes already?
You're fine.
Fine.
Oh, really? Because I got more slides and stuff. All right.
You got plenty there.
Okay.
I guess my biggest point is when you go out and try to engage your community, which you are famous for, that's what you all do, and everybody knows it. You get people to do what they're not generally inclined to do, which is something out of the ordinary, something inconvenient, something that requires a lot of thought and decision-making, and you get them to go out there and do it. That's what needs to happen here. Thank you.
All right, well, I don't know if I have quite that much to say as my co-panelist, Ms. Boucher, does. And I'll speak from what I would say is of concern to me, both as a practitioner in this community and the things that I see with my clients on a daily basis with respect to how this census and the citizenship issue question is going to be handled on this upcoming census, if it's going to be handled. I think everybody probably is aware of the fact that the actual argument on this matter is going to be heard by the Supreme Court on the 23rd, as my co-panelist pointed out, is next Tuesday. Unbelievably. So I think that this is a very important and live topic in current climate and the current administration. I know that the judges initially in January pushed this, or in February, I believe, took this off the agenda. They didn't want to hear this matter, and then I think because of the ongoing litigation and issues The judges really wanted to hear it. From what I recall, there's litigation that's going on in the Second Circuit. New York, definitely in the Ninth. There's challenges from Texas that are coming out based on what Maryland has done, the Fifth Circuit. So definitely the Fourth Circuit is looking into this issue. So this issue keeps popping up. Very similar to what happened with the travel ban as well, where people turned around and said we're not going to stand for this. And I think that the same is happening with this issue, which seems very nominal and marginal, but it's not. As a side note about political views, I thought it was so ironic from your slide that the Department of Justice gets such a large apportionment of funds allocated to assist in victims of crime and enforcement in victims of crime issues. And my clients wait up to, I think last I checked, between 4.5 to 5.5 years to get their petition as a victim of crime to be adjudicated by the Vermont Service Center, the only immigration service center that's responsible for and hearing people that have been victims of crime who are undocumented that furthered their enforcement and the solution of crime in their community. And it's also that the Department of Homeland Security has, yet again, apportionment of such large funds through the census for enforcement. Yet I, time and time again, don't see much of the funds being apportioned to the Department of Justice to decide these cases by the immigration judges that have a docket that goes anywhere from, on a short end, 18 months to as long as 36 to 48 months in certain districts, which I find just ironic in terms of how things get a proportion. So that's my political speech. I think that what really spoke to me when I was thinking about how to frame this issue and why this issue matters, I was researching a lot on this issue because not being an American born and not having had exposure extensively to census, I find this topic fascinating. And I'm going to quote and read from, it's the Asian American Advancing Justice handout on census and why, and it's talking about debunking the myths of citizenship question in the 2020 census. And this portion really spoke very powerfully to me because I think it really summarizes why this issue matters globally, or why this issue matters in terms of all of the United States at large. The myth, too, that they speak about is the census count is only about apportionment and redistricting. And the answer to that from whoever put together this brochure is different. And it says that census data are a vital tool to address the nation's legacy of slavery, racism, and discrimination. The collection of accurate, comprehensive race and ethnicity data, as well as data on gender, age, and household composition in the census, is essential to implementing, monitoring, and evaluating many civil rights, I'm going to add to that civil and human rights, laws and policies, including equal opportunity and access across all economic and social sectors of society, such as housing and the job market. I found that to be a very powerful statement as relates to why this issue matters. This isn't just a small collateral or a small non-significant issue that our country is facing. This is a major issue that the Supreme Court is going to hear. With respect to, well, how did it get to the Supreme Court? Why does it matter to the Supreme Court? How does that even tag the Constitution? And I think the question here is very basic and very straightforward. What does the Enumeration Clause speak on this matter, and how does what's happening in our country violate the Enumeration Clause? And what I would say to that is, well, how is the citizenship question reasonably related to the goal of getting what I would call an accurate census? Well, how does somebody's lack or having U.S. citizenship have anything to do with collecting information about whether that person is to be accounted for appropriately in our district? And I personally have seen a lot of these bizarre but very subdued attacks, in my opinion, directly on people that are people of color, foreign nationals, people that are disabled, people that don't have the same access to resources, because this question is scary. This question is intimidating. With respect to immigration law, there is a very severe and grave consequence for what happens when you make a claim, false claim, or indirectly a false claim to U.S. citizenship. The law starts from punishing you at the port of entry, at the border, where you could or could not represent yourself to be a U.S. citizen for any reason, such as to avoid an extensive line of questioning, such as to avoid being deported time and time again out of this country, such as to avoid just being in a confrontational situation. You could make an oral claim to be a U.S. citizen, despite even have concrete knowledge to your lack thereof, and be penalized severely from your ability to seek benefits in this country, orally, if that is documented by an enforcement officer or anybody into your file. And that happens time and time again, excuse me, that my client comes to me and I look at their file and I find an orally written down or an orally made claim to U.S. citizenship when the client bona fidely believed that the client is a citizen, or the client just wanted to get out of a very dicey, difficult situation. You will find, too, that in writing, the concept of making a false claim or a claim to citizenship matters very much. In our district and in our circuit, which is the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals that mandates Minnesota cases, we have 4 very nasty, very bad cases that talk about individuals in different walks of life, excuse me, doing different things, claiming to be citizens. One individual wanted to get a job, and he told his time and time again to his boss that he is a U.S. citizen. And the 8th Circuit turned around and said, well, I think you made a false claim to citizenship and you should be penalized from forever not being able to receive any immigration benefits. Forever. When we have multiple waivers in the Immigration and Nationality Act for crimes, for other transgressions, for removal orders, for being here undocumented, a false claim, or a claim to citizenship when you had no basis for us forever. We have another case where the individual filled out a form that all of us filled out, if not everyone here has filled out, called the I-9. And that form just asked, point blank, are you a U.S. citizen? Are you a U.S. national? Are you a permanent resident or an individual with an authorization to work? To the average individual that's filling out this form, they do not have an understanding of what any of those 4 boxes, now 3, mean. And so when the person pencil whips through those boxes, when the person who's a foreign national very often pencil whip through those boxes, they don't really understand the difference between being a U.S. citizen and a U.S. national. Let's start with that. Most often they have medium to low education, if any education whatsoever. And when they go through that form and fill it out, the intent most often is not to declare yourself as a U.S. citizen, but to get a job, to support their family, to be able to work and just exist in this country, or to declare just in error that I think maybe I'm a citizen because dad is a citizen through the old Amnesty Act. I think grandma was born in Texas. Well, I'm just going to say I'm a citizen as well. And our circuit court punishes you for that. So making an allegation and a claim on something as simple as an employment form has consequences here in Minnesota and all other areas of the United States, unless you're lucky enough to be in California or certain parts of Texas where that law does not apply and it doesn't matter. Time and time again, the immigration forms that any individual would want who is not a U.S. citizen, who's a foreign national, would want to fill out, that are filled out under a very severe penalty of perjury, ask you that exact question. The green card form asks you, which is the form I-485, application to register as a permanent resident, asks you point blank on page 13, part 8, question 66. Have you ever, not in the past 5 years, not in the last year, not in the last decade, have you ever said that you are a United States citizen? And you have to sign that form under penalty of perjury and not lie, because you never know how the government will find your information. Citizenship application, when you become a naturalized United States citizen, asks you several questions to that end. And those questions are, have you ever given the U.S. government any ever given U.S. government any false or misleading information? Or have you ever openly lied to a U.S. government official to gain entry or admission to the United States? Those two questions repeat themselves back to back on the citizenship application. And time again, I have clients that come to me and tell me their story. I have clients that come and tell me their story about the fact that they registered to vote or accidentally voted because they believed that they were either entitled or required by law to do so. And time again, we face very severe concerns when they either go to apply for a green card or either go to naturalize with respect to making a claim to U.S. citizenship. In court, if you are an undocumented alien and you're presenting your case to the immigration judge, and all the equities are in your favor, you've established all the statutory eligibility for relief. In other words, you've been here for a long time. You're not a bad person. You were picked up for a traffic infraction, or you used to drink, and you have DWIs and you went to treatment because now you understand your children and your family matters very much. You've turned yourself around and you've invested in this community. You live in this country. You're just trying to do your best. The judge has the right to deny your case if there's ever any kind of paper, including that I-9 form that the government likes to present, or any other paper, such as a documentation from a border encounter, that you've made a claim to U.S. citizenship, knowingly or unknowingly. So this question is very, very, very troublesome, in my opinion. What troubles me also in how this census question is coming up on the 2020 census is that what is the true perception of that document? And I think that my co-panelist very articulately introduced that issue. What is the perception of receiving that form in the mail to a person that is an undocumented, unregistered foreign national, a person who's not a citizen? The first thing that I would say to that, and again, speaking from personal experience, is that individuals that are foreign nationals, that are not rooted in this community permanently in terms of being born in this community, don't know what that document is. Number two, having gone for those individuals that are foreign nationals that don't understand exactly what that form is, but having gone through the immigration process and having seen how easily it is to obtain certain documents that are even protected documents. Classic example is asylum seekers that face time and time again what's called the document verification from the government that can actually pick up a license plate from Cameroon and say, Your Honor, this is fake. Because we have a committee that verified that this license plate, this birth certificate from Ukraine, this document of record of marriage from Tajikistan is a fraud. Because we have a Library of Congress that researches and our own individual forensic evaluators that can tell you this document is fake. In other words, if that information is discoverable in court and has a binding effect on immigration status, having gone through a process like that as a foreign national to a certain extent, you would be very careful filling out any other documents that talk about who are you and what you are in this country, if you're a U.S. citizen or not. So the fear that I have is the perception of, well, what is the weight of this document and who does in fact have access to that document? The other concern is that having, again, lived in this country as a foreign national and gone through the immigration process, there is the concept of FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. Most people believe that FOIA discovers everything. In other words, when you submit a FOIA, you're entitled to pick up every part of your file. And that's a recurrent misconception that foreign nationals live with. Isn't the government tracking my steps and getting all this information on me? And if I fill out this census question, if I fill out that I am or am not a U.S. citizen, doesn't that mean that the government has data on me because they know where I live, because they're going to come and knock on my door, that I am or am not a U.S. citizen? And I think that misconception and putting that question there is going to create a lot of that fear and alienation. That fear and alienation leads to nothing good, in my opinion, and in what I've seen through working with the immigrant community. The distribution of resources and what resources that are required in the immigrant community, as my co-panelists mentioned, are the exact issues that are addressed by census. You would not believe how many of individuals that are coming to the United States to seek a better life, to grow themselves in this community, do have family members that are special needs, that have concerns and issues with their own or their family's access to any kind of medical care and resources. Most foreign nationals do not come from countries that do not have a good, that do have a good healthcare system. Most individuals that are foreign nationals that at least arrive to Minnesota are people that are highly deconditioned. They do not have access to adequate medical care, and as such, things start to fall apart. Their offsprings or individuals that they are living with need access to adequate medical care that they will not get if they don't fill out the census. So that's crucial and very important. And seeing so many families with foreign nationals, with US-born children with disabilities really concerns me with respect to that question. Access to adequate protection, community crime, having access to any type of system and demographic, police enforcement, any other access to safety issues is something that really plagues the immigrant community. Again, if they don't fill out the census, as we've seen from the statistics, those funds are not going to those communities, and that's a very alarming issue. Having access to education resources. As we know, foreign nationals that immigrate to this country or come live here, documented or not, are usually not very proficient in English. It takes them a certain period of time to acquire and adapt to the English language. If they are not aware of what the census is, if they don't have access to those resources are not appropriately allocated, then we're missing out on the ability to bring people to an adequate level and bring people to a similarly situated level as they're entitled to. And that's, again, a grave concern with respect to the 2020 census question, putting that citizenship question there. So I'm not going to take too much time talking about, what other concerns I see with respect to this issue, but in terms of alienation, segregation, in terms of having access to adequate resources, in terms of properly and appropriately not excluding an immigrant or foreign national community by placing that question on the census form, I don't think that's what we're going to achieve with that administration. If the Supreme Court tells us on the 23rd that this is an issue, I don't see how appropriately enumerating individuals and accounting for them in our community, irrespective of their accident of birth, has anything to do with their accident of birth. So that's, again, my take on the matter, and I'll rather leave more for questions. I'd like this to be as engaging and interesting for you than you hear me talk about my experiences. So I'll move on to our last panelist.
Well, good evening. That's a tough act to follow, both of them. I just wanted to say that I'll be covering what are briefly, because it's been shared already in some detail, the impacts of the citizenship question, some figures that I was able to identify. What are some of the challenges that we'll have here in the city of St. Louis Park, and then a plea for some help as we look forward to overcoming some of the challenges that we've identified. So specific to the citizenship question, the question that's being proposed is this person a citizen of the United States? And that question, the inclusion of that question wasn't announced until March 26, 2018, which is relatively late in the process of establishing the census. And in fact, they had some studies that were already underway about what are the census barriers and attitudes and motivators, and how can we work with some focus groups and work on our messaging about the census. And those were already underway, and this popped up, and they had to sort of add it toward midstream of that research. And of course, the result was that it will likely be a major barrier to some people. And especially from what I could tell, were highlighted were Spanish, U.S. mainland residents, and Middle East and North African women especially, although it was a challenge across the board. Now, the Census Bureau is estimating that the overall response rate nationwide will decline by 1%, but that hasn't been tested or even tried in their 3 end-to-end test runs that they've had. And 1%, I think that's overall nationwide. I think it's likely much stronger impact to those communities that would be most concerned about the citizenship question. One thing I will say is that dozens of states, and this was mentioned, dozens of states, the ACLU and others are challenging this. It's already had 3 losses in the courts and is now going to the Supreme Court. So fingers are crossed that this does not move forward. However, that said, I think in many ways the damage is done. There's been a lot of press about the citizenship question. I think the concerns are already there, and we have a hurdle to go over to overcome that. I'm also pleased to say that the American Planning Association, with which I'm affiliated, filed a friend of the court amicus brief also opposing the citizenship question. So we're pleased to see that. So kind of rolling now to more of what's challenges here for City of St. Louis Park. There are many hard-to-count demographics that the Census Bureau has identified. Some of these, as you read through them, I won't read them for you, likely you identify as one of these folks or know people that do. And so bringing them some information and reaching out to them is something that we are hoping that you are willing to do, and there'll be opportunities that we're creating as well to improve our messaging to the community that will be impacted here in St. Louis Park. Snowbirds is one of the major ones, obviously. Also, some of our people of color and indigenous, foreign-born or language challenged as far as English speaking, and people living in poverty, as well as renters. We have an enormous rental community, and trying to reach out to those folks. So just some data about the city of St. Louis Park specifically. In 2000, you'll see on the left side of this chart were our response rates. I'm sorry, it's a little difficult to read. Our response rates, they ranged from a high of 92%, I believe, response rate to the initial mailing that went out to folks. And then it was as low as 75% in parts of the community. As in the nation as a whole and in St. Louis Park, it may not be too discernible here, but our response rates declined in 2010. Now, that wasn't consistent throughout the entire community. Some areas actually did improve, others did not. Not to pick on any particular area of town, but we did have the biggest drop was from a 92% participation rate to a 75% participation rate in 2010 in the Birchwood and Sorensen neighborhoods. So I'm not sure what was behind that, what caused that, but I am interested in what we can do to avoid it next time. That said, we also have some data from the Census Bureau predicting the non-response rates. So I'm flipping this on you. Last one was participation rates. This one are the folks that don't respond to at least the initial mailing that comes out. Those are ranging as high as 22% in the community for certain parts of the community. So how are we going to try to have more and more people respond to that first notice that comes to them? The Census Bureau is not being funded at the levels that they have been in the past, and so they're looking for ways to streamline the process, offer things, take advantage of technology using web-based online tools as well as the phone options, because they will not have the level of staffing that they've had previously to knock on doors. So it is important to us to see that happen. So what's the city's role in this? Number one, we want to promote the census. And I'll highlight this more, but we're partnering with the Census Bureau, the State of Minnesota Demographer's Office, the Hennepin County and neighboring cities to learn what each of us are doing, what's being successful, how can we move ahead and counter this. We want to partner with schools, places of worship, community organizations, folks like the League of Women Voters and others to tap both your resources and knowledge about the community, your connections and trusted relationships in the community, so that we can share this information with others. We also want to establish a complete count committee locally. We are still seeking partners for that, so there are opportunities for that. And at this point, we're not capping it. We're keeping it very informal. We will be as inclusive as we can be. And if we get too big, we'll start forming subcommittees and steering committees. But that hasn't been the challenge so far. So we are looking for volunteers. And then the role of that group will be to co-create some messages that will be effective in this community in St. Louis Park, and for the renters and the hard-to-count folks in the community. And we want to do that through trusted ambassadors. The other thing that we've been doing, we've been at this for a year now already. We have been at the city providing accurate base data to the Census Bureau about the addresses in the community, so that they know that their surveys are going to all the addresses in the community. We're tracking new construction, we're providing boundary changes. A lot of staff effort has gone into that already. So the city's goals are the same as the Census Bureau's in one regard, to have a complete and accurate count. Obviously, for some of the reasons that have been identified, we want to know who our community is. We want to know where we're going. We want to know who we're serving. One of the you had mentioned the Asian Americans group and some of the information they provided. I saw a presentation recently from them, and they were able to, with FBI approvals, get some disaggregated data about the Asian category of the races, so that they would have more detail about which races were reported in those categories. And with that information, they were able to wipe out the disparities among some of those groups on being insured. So they found a correlation between certain ethnic groups and small business and entrepreneurial owners that did not have insurance. They were able to target efforts in that area and wipe out in, in 4 years that disparity. So it's a powerful tool. The other thing is we want to make sure that we are maintaining our representation and influence, obviously, in the state and in the United States government. And we also value, of course, the money, the dollars that come here. I did a quick review of just city projects in the last 8 years that included federal money, that excludes state money, school districts, and it was $25 million in the last 8 years. So it is a huge resource to us. Stephanie has raised some great questions and illustrated the challenges ahead of us and framed the task ahead. So again, we'll be looking for ways that you can help. You could join the Complete Count Committee efforts. You could volunteer in another way if you don't, if you'd rather not have a night meeting or have if that's not your thing. Obviously, there's other opportunities. You can reach out to neighbors. You can talk to others on your own. There may be events and things that we organize or participate in, like Parktacular or other things like that, where we're getting out, and we're going to need volunteers and help for that. And then lastly, there are opportunities to work for the United States Census Bureau as an enumerator or other role. They're going to be hiring, I think, 7,600 people in the state as enumerators. And those are in Hennepin County specifically. They're paying $20 an hour. These are temporary jobs. They're not permanent jobs, but they're temporary jobs, but there's certainly an opportunity here for people that are going to be effective in our community to apply and participate in that process. Also, if you want to learn more, 4 of the areas that I've found very useful: the U.S. Census Bureau homepage, the State Demographer's homepage. Also, the Minnesota Council on Nonprofits has been a huge advocate in doing research on focus groups in Minnesota and messaging that will be important and useful in Minnesota specifically, and for these undercounted groups. And what's nice from the research that they've learned is that although each one varies a bit, there are common themes. And so it's really just a matter of tailoring our messages to those themes that are of concern, and also having that message delivered by someone that's trusted by that community. And then finally, I usually don't put plugs in for the media specifically, but NPR's correspondent Hansilo Wang is by far providing the best coverage of this. And so I would recommend that if you want to dive deeper. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much for your presentations. And now if people would like to come and ask a question, feel free to come up to the microphone up here and state your name and question, or who you're directing your question to, possibly.
Mike Hendon's the name, and whoever wants to answer it. What is the penalty, if there is, for either refusing to answer a specific question or answering it wrong?
I've got this.
Thank you.
None. There is no penalty. It is the law that you are supposed to be counted, but there is no enforcement of it, and you will never get a ticket, say, for not filling out your census form. So the enforcement is none. Yes, ma'am.
Please come up to the microphone.
I'm T.O. I'd like a clarification. Will they count the census if one or more questions are left blank? There are different things that happen on different ballots, and that's a question I'm actually hearing from people, like, well, if I don't answer it, will they throw the whole thing out? Type of situation.
Here's the deal. They will accept as completed census forms that are not completely filled out. But here's the rub. We don't know yet which questions will be able to be skipped. She's asking whether a certain percentage or what particular questions, or if two boxes aren't checked or filled out, is that enough to get it thrown out? Or if 7 out of 10 aren't filled out, does that count? And the answer is we simply don't know yet. I do know for a fact that incomplete census forms will be counted, but we don't know yet which questions will be the determinative factor for being counted or not counted. I have just a couple more silly facts before we go, and for cake, I mean. This coming up census season, the census is going to be translated into 10 different languages, which is marvelous, except the largest populations of foreign-borns coming through and living in Minnesota are from Mexico, followed by Somalia, India, and Laos, which is a combination of Hmong and Vietnamese. Now, again, here's the catch. It's wonderful that the census is acknowledging the diversity of America and translating the census form to reach people. However, in Minnesota, our issues are Hmong, Somalia, a lot of East African.
And also, I was going to
foreign-borns.
say, if my microphone is on, a very large Eastern European population. Russian and Ukrainian is one of the dominant languages that is used in and translated by Hennepin County for resources.
Well, three languages that aren't going to be translated are Hmong, Somali, and I don't know if I'm saying this correctly, so forgive my ignorance. Oromo?
Oromo, yeah.
Oromo,
Eastern African.
which is Eastern Africa. So that's really going to matter to us. But if we can get all the appropriate funding that is necessary, and we've got a bill going through the legislature to try to get that funding, we can get all those translations done in plenty of time. What I was saying at the end was people can take the census over the telephone, even if, say, there's a younger child in the house that speaks English quite well. They can get on the phone and say, I'm counting my grandma. Grandma, what's your birthday? Or whatever the question is. And it will count as being completed without a paper form or without a formal translator. And that's marvelous. And here's one more fun fact that I just absolutely loved. On the night of April 1st, 2020, there will be a blitz in Minneapolis and St. Paul trying to catch and capture all that valuable data from people who are currently experiencing homelessness. So if you live primarily under the 4th Street Bridge and that's your address, you will be counted, and all of that incredibly valuable information from that person will be, I don't know, accounted for. However, it'll only be one night. I would strongly recommend putting together a CCC committee. We have lots of tips on how to form them and what needs to be done in the next actions to be taken. Let's see, I'm kind of spread out from hell to breakfast here, aren't I? Oh, the last thing I wanted to say. This is the case. Front and double, right? From New York by Judge Jesse Furman, who said you cannot put the census question on the the citizenship question, excuse me, on the 2020 census. And the reason is not because of constitutionality, and it's not because of racial bias, it's because you didn't file the administrative processes. You didn't follow the process that must be taken. And these census questions are demoed for years before they are allowed on a 10-year census. So the judge said no, not on constitutionality or racial bias, but because of just plain old, you didn't follow the rules, dude. So.
Yeah, our administration really cares about following the rule these days, and really gonna care about procedure, so.
Does anyone else have a question for the panelists? Please.
If not all the questions need to be answered, if Minnesota wanted to make sure that everyone in Minnesota felt comfortable filling out the census, what if no one answered that question? I mean, what if people were encouraged to just skip it, like people are able to now when you're asked about your race? I'd rather not say. And so, you know, we'd still get the count, and everyone would feel safe because no one was saying they were. So when you didn't answer it, it was a finger pointed at you. Would that be a possibility?
I'm not the authority on this, but I will say that I was, again, at a presentation really, I feel like they did know kind of what was going on, which was, while there isn't a lot of enforcement of the rules on this, there is a schedule of violations and penalties if you don't complete it. But frankly, I'm a rule maker. I'm a law enforcer in this community, and frankly, I would not advocate for anyone to not complete this form in its entirety. It is valuable data to learn not only who we are and where we're going, but also someday, I'm a genealogist on the side. Someday it'll tell something about your children, about you and your ancestors. I think it's important. So I wouldn't advocate skipping questions.
I just want to be sure,
You're close to the mic, Deb.
I just want to be sure that the citizenship question cannot be, if it ends up in the census deal, that any president can't do a proclamation and say, we're going to get ICE on this. Is that true? Did that make sense the way I asked it?
I think so, and I think your concern is that you're worried about the sweeping end of enforcement, or what happens when enforcement happens if this question makes it on there.
Right.
Am I getting it right? I think in terms of enforcement and enforcement efforts, I think they're a bit more complex than that. I'd like to believe that they're a bit more complex than that, and I'd like to believe that that ICE has other things to do and bigger fish to fry than this. I'd like to believe that. That's what I'd like to believe. And nobody really knows fully how enforcement operates and why enforcement operates in the way that it does. If we did, we'd predict trends, and then we wouldn't have, sweeping enforcement. That would be the greatest thing ever. But having said that, I think that the pragmatic difficulty that, what I believe and what you and I believe, the pragmatic difficulty isn't so much the outcome that there is sweeping enforcement, is the innate fear of having that question being looking at you, and you as the individual that needs to be accounted for wanting to respond or not respond, not knowing if they're breaking the law or not knowing the extreme importance and understanding the extreme importance of what the rest of that form is. And I think that, again, as far as I understand and what I've been seeing, it's a tool that is being used to segregate, divide, and silence certain segments of the community, and that is the greatest concern. So that's what I would answer to that.
Thank you.
So having said that, it kind of brings a question to my mind. And I guess it seems to me that over the years, the questions for people who are non-citizens seem to have increased. In other words, the racial situation in the country seems to be getting worse and worse. And so does it seem to you like there are more and more hoops to jump through for people coming to this country who want to gain citizenship just by virtue of politics? Or, it seems to me like it's growing these days, not just in the U.S., but in all parts of the world where there are so many refugees because of the, wars and so forth going on. But do you think politically that this is just more ways to discriminate against people? Is that your feeling, or is that just something that I've picked up on?
I think the immigration lawyer should tackle that one.
I think that there has been definitely more trends to alienate, silence, and segregate undocumented individuals, or individuals that are documented. And when I talk to my physician, who's Iranian-born, that is trying to immigrate to this country by way of Paris, that has to go through volumes of scrutiny, and it's the same conversation that I'm having with a woman that is a Somali national that has children and a husband living in the United States, that they are faced with the same scrutiny of being able to lawfully immigrate to this country I do think that there's more and more in this administration that stifles the process. And I think that the stifling of the process is intentional. I think the stifling of the process is speaking to certain constituents and certain individuals that hold a certain worldview that has very little to do with reality and what really truly happens in our communities. And I feel that this culture of fear, of anti-immigrant, anti-foreign national, is growing, and it's taken hold in documentation. It's not just dicta that people say. I think it does impact how communities are operating. I think it impacts everybody, especially with what I would say with the dogma is so far from the truth. I mean, there's these myths that people believe in about foreign nationals that are myths that bear very little weight in reality. And so to answer that question, yeah, I do think that this is a tool to continue that segment, to continue that unfriendliness towards foreign nationals of all walks of life, be it a Latino roofer from Puebla or an Iranian physician that is coming to do cancer research in this country, right? Or a refugee that has suffered so much that all they need is a place of refuge. I do see this as an added layer of that same scrutiny and that same "you're not welcome" message, which is very scary, very scary.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions?
Hello. Okay, so my question I think is for Shawn. So I think St. Louis Park is at like 493,000 people, if I remember correctly. Does that sound right?
I mean the state.
In
Foreign.
St. Louis Park.
We're at 48,000, almost
48.
49,000.
Okay, I had too many zeros
Almost
there.
49,000 people.
So when we do the census, do you think we'll get over 50,000 people? And then what would be the changes that would happen after we get to that amount?
Okay, well, we're on a trend, yes. We're on a trend line to increase in population. We are right now, I believe, at the highest population in our entire history. There was a time where we were in decline, and we've been steadily going back up, and I believe now we're going to be at our highest population. At 50,000 people, there's a few benefits to that. Some of them are in our housing sector. It provides us additional authority and flexibility in funding housing in the community. But that's the only item that I have identified that 50,000 is the magic number. At some stage, down the road, if you reach, I think it's 100,000, you do change your classification of city in the state of Minnesota, which comes with it a lot more of authority as well. But we're nowhere near that and not projected to achieve that anytime soon. But the 50,000 could be significant to us in some respects.
And so when do you think that we would hit that 50,000?
I believe we're projected to do so by 2030. So it's a pretty slow, steady growth.
Okay.
But we're already above where Met Council has projected us to grow. So everything comes in ebbs and flows, and we're on the same trend line. But right now we're in a period of faster growth than what was anticipated by Met Council.
Great. Thanks so much.
Yep.
I have one question for you all, and that is, did you get your question answered? There was an agenda title here tonight. If it wasn't answered, what can we do to get you the information you need to feel like your question was answered?
I'm new to Minnesota and to St. Louis Park. I live in Park Shore. I guess my question is there going to be a brochure or something that's readily available that communities like Park Shore can use to kind of prepare everybody for the census. And bear in mind that, like most retirement communities, we have a lot of staff who are foreign born. And it's just as important for them to hear, maybe more important for them to know what's coming than it is for the rest of us old folks. Also, as a sidelight, did you all notice, I think it was this morning's paper, that Minnesota's number of immigrants has just plummeted? That was amazing. And we know why that is.
I'll let the two of you answer about the brochure.
Sure. I'll start.
You bet.
You're welcome to later on. So certainly the city, what I'm pleased to say is that since the 2010 census to now, our communication tools have expanded widely, and we are, I think we'll have a much more impressive toolbox to work with. In addition to the newsletter, the Park Perspectives will have articles that are periodically showing up over the next year in advance of the census, so that will provide information, our website, our social media, and of course our cable channels will be running information on. So we'll be out in the community. In fact, Park Shores is on my list to stop out and speak to the group. I believe they have monthly meetings where they convene discussions, so we'll be out in the community making presentations as well. So if there are events that you would like to see staff at, we would be happy to do that. We're doing outreach not just for census, but for other items. And we had to recognize that some folks are going to respond better to a brochure, and so we'll probably be printing some of those as well. I'm not quite sure yet what the state will have available, but maybe we can talk about that. But one thing I'll just mention, I probably meant to highlight was, it was mentioned earlier, the racial disparities in this country are significant, historic, and current. And racial equity is one of the key strategic directions and goals here in the community. And we're trying to address that. We are going to be doing outreach on the census. We're hoping to build relationships in the community that last well beyond the census 2020. So that's one of our goals here in the city too. Thanks.
To piggyback off of that, in terms of timing, what we can expect is March 12th through the 20th, an invitation to respond to the census and an explanation of what it is will go out. From March 16th through the 24th, there'll be a reminder letter. And if you haven't responded yet, you'll get a reminder postcard. April 8th through the 16th, you'll get a reminder letter and paper questionnaire, and the 20th through the 27th of April of 2020, a final reminder postcard before people start knocking on the door. And they're called enumerators, and it's $20 an hour for the metro region. And my understanding, because I'm very elevated. I sit 3 seats down from the demographer's office, is that there is almost no way that Minnesota can reach the amount of census workers that are necessary to complete this process. I mean, so many people would need to apply. It's almost amazing. And Andrew throws out a number that I can't remember, but 20,000 people, or 20,000 applicants are going to be necessary to get the 7,600 or the 7,300 people that we need. So it's going to be a huge employment opportunity, especially for people who speak other languages, because of course, people who speak your language are far more likely to be positively responded to at the door. Thank you.
Please.
Hi. You mentioned a variety of ways that people can respond, from phone to mail to online to garage sales, whatever. So I'm assuming there is a process for addressing duplication when people fill it out more than once for whatever reason, accidentally mostly. Do you think there's also a fear, like there, about repercussions if I do the census more than once? You know, like there is about the fear of people voting more than once. Is there a fear of what if I fill out the census 3 times because I didn't know and it kept coming in the mail, or I did it online and my mother did it and my grandfather did it, and that kind of stuff?
Well, I'll just mention, if you do complete the form on the first try, you won't receive a mailing in the notice, or another mailed notice. So it is designed so that if they've received a response for an address, they do not send another.
There she went. I think that we are dealing with the opposite problem of not filling out the census, but I understand completely what you're saying. You don't want to be punished for doing something wrong. And if you don't know what the census is or have been enculturated, like some of us have, you may very well have that fear. Remember all those big bucks I said that the feds are paying to make sure that the census data is safe? Also embedded in that technology is duplication responsibility. You are not going to be punished for doing something twice, and here's the thing. Say mom and dad aren't speaking to each other. Say dad just moved out. They've, both mom and dad got census forms. Who's gonna put the kids on? If both report the kids, nobody's in trouble. Nobody's in trouble either way, even if the kids don't get reported accidentally. But that would certainly, not be fulfilling the mission of the census. Letting you know, one of the primary people, the primary groups of people who are uncounted, and this blows my mind, are children under the age of 5. And they're not counted 80% of the time in households that have filled out their census.
Yeah.
I don't know how that is. There's a baby bucket right here. He's got a name. Write it down. But somehow that is one of the historically undercounted people. Also, some logistical questions. College students. If your college student lives in a dorm, the dorm will be reporting. If your college student lives off campus, your college student needs to take care of his census form himself. If your college student is in your basement, that's a whole different that's a whole different bucket. People who are in jails, people who are in prisons, institutions, the jail or the prison will be responsible for counting. But again, I'm laying my bias bare here. People with developmental disabilities who are currently living in corporate foster care or group homes, as they're referred to. The people who own the group homes aren't going to be asked to count all the people in their residences. Right? Potentially a problem. Let's see, who else? Oh, one other tip I was going to give. Snowbirds are a big portion of the St. Louis Park population, I would imagine. Is that,
Yes.
Is that true? Here's the thing. Get ahead of your snowbirds. Get them before they leave and let them know When that census form comes for whichever house you're at, you fill it out that you live in Minnesota. And once they're gone, you'll never be able to get that information out to them. You have to get it early and inform them, you're going to get a census form. Here's what you do with it. And you can save everybody a lot of pain with a little pre-information.
Okay, well, it's close to 9. That was the time we had decided we would hopefully wrap up, so it looks like we're in pretty good shape. I want to thank all 3 of our speakers so much for talking about the subject. And thanks, everybody, for coming tonight. And don't forget to have some cake.